to turn to Special Envoy Greenblatt because as we move forward into this 26th day of the war, a lot of the focus now is on the perception of the war. We're very well aware here in Jerusalem how this war has now transformed perceptually on the screens of American television to become as if all of a sudden Israel launched this massive attack against innocent Gazans. That's the way the war clearly is being broadcast on whether it's CNN or other international networks. I want to ask Special Envoy Greenblatt, great to have you. Give us your sense from where you sit in the United States, also about the massive outbreak of violence and anti-Semitic rhetoric on university campuses, also in major cities where you are near New York and in other states. How are you connecting that to the the massacre dash current war that we're in now opposite the Hamas and the Iranian operatives in Gaza?
So thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for the important briefing. Thanks for all the work that you do. Let me just first start with Iran, Dan, because you raised Iran. I think one of the things that people miss here is the connection to Iran. I worked in the Trump administration. I'm a conservative. I'm a Republican, but I've been very complimentary about President Biden. I have my criticisms about what he's doing. I've been very complimentary about how he's handled the relationship with Israel in this terrible time. But one of those criticisms was very important, and it ties to your question, which is they refused to make the connection between the Iranian regime and what happened on October 7th. Yes, they say that, of course, Iran trains and funds Hamas and all that, but they refuse to make the connection. And the reason they say it is because they can't find that smoking gun that connects the two. We should remind everybody that, unfortunately, there was a massive intelligence failure, both on Israel's side, the United States side, everyone's side. If they couldn't find the smoking gun for the attack before October 7th, certainly it's going to be tough for them to find the smoking gun connection in the near future. So it's very, very important from an explanation of the war as to why Israel has to do what it's doing, is that this is a threat for the existential existence of Israel, not just from October 7th, not just from what this Hamas spokesman spoke about in a recent video that was released, that he says October 7th is just the beginning. There'll be more October 7ths, ultimately until Israel is destroyed. But people have to understand that the Iranian regime is front and center on this, and that this is not just a threat to Israel, but it's a threat to the entire region. Vision 2030, all of these countries that have these massive, amazing plans to transform the region. You mentioned the rocket, the errant rocket falling in Jordan. Everything that attacks Israel ultimately is designed and to be used to attack the region after they try to do what they want to do with Israel. From the, let's call it the public relations perspective here in America, I watch CNN all the time. My CNN version, I believe, is different than yours. You watch the international version. The international version coverage, which I haven't seen, but I've heard from many, many people, is actually quite bad. The CNN coverage here, I would say I would give it a decent grade. They've actually done a pretty good job explaining the atrocities, explaining the hostages. In fact, they have many Israeli families who have loved ones who've been taken hostage. They've done a lot of interviews. Of course, they do focus on the damage and destruction in Gaza. Sometimes they do it in the right context, other times they do not. All of the news media failed here, and I'm sure everywhere around the world, with the hospital that turned out to be an errant rocket from Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Some corrected it, some admitted failure, others kind of doubled down, which is a terrible thing. I think we have just really a massive public relations explanation that has to be ongoing. And that is part of the issue that we see on college campuses and even on city streets, even in my own hometown in New Jersey. There was a large protest here the other day. We're seeing hateful people who are bussed in from other areas. Many of them are actually paid, from what I understand. We see crazy things going on college campuses. And I'll just end a little, before I take your questions, maybe on a little bit more of a positive note. In the last 24 to 48 hours, I'm beginning to see some sanity returning to college campuses and even on city streets. Some colleges are starting to clamp down on these things. They're starting to issue better statements in the face of terrible statements and inaction that have taken place. So I'm hopeful that sanity is now starting to seep into administrations. I think it's a very, very large battle to fight. But even at Cornell, where there was this terrible threat against Jewish students, Governor Hochul jumped in, The state police, the FBI have somebody in custody now who made those threats. We're seeing even at Columbia, where there were some terrible, terrible statements made, terrible faculty letters being sent. There's now some faculty, actually a large group of faculty, who are pushing back against that. And the only way this really happens is if we open our mouths and explain the reality of what Israel is facing, the reality of what Israel is doing, the reality of war. And if we do that right, I'm hopeful that we could connect with the people who are intellectually honest and leave aside the irrational haters. We'll never convince them. So maybe I'll end here and start to take your questions.
Jason, one of the observations that we were making here is this this connection that is not self-evident between the BDS boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign, which is many years old campaign, which actually includes, as constituent members of the Boycott National Committee in Ramallah, includes terrorist organizations, including the Hamas, including Islamic Jihad, including the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. They are all on the BDS National Committee in Ramallah. And in that context, Jason, I'm wondering how you see, let's say, a BDS pathway that we sense led directly to the massacre on October 7th and directly into this extraordinarily bloody outcome with 240 kidnapped victims tortured and hidden away in different parts of Gaza, which is what triggered the Israeli defensive maneuver to go into Gaza. The question, the connection between BDS, which has always been considered, where you are, a peaceful grassroots liberation movement on behalf of Palestinians and nominally a Palestinian state, when the sense here is that that paved the way to the massacre on October 7th because of the genocidal statements that have been made for years on these campuses around the United States.
I would say it didn't necessarily pave the way, but it was certainly an important weapon in the arsenal of the haters of Israel, meaning they've educated people, they're well-funded, they're well-organized, they lie, they deceive, and they have spent a long time trying to convince people that Israel is a colonial occupier, that they've stolen Palestinian land. Of course, if you take it to its extreme, which many do, everybody's a fair target. You know, the burned babies, the pregnant woman whose stomach was cut open, the mother whose breast was cut off, all of those are legitimate targets for what BDS claims was Jews or Israelis stealing Palestinian land. So I do think it's an essential component. I think we need to fight back even harder than we've ever done, but it's only one, unfortunately, one of many tools in the arsenal of the Iranian regime and Hamas and others who want to try to destroy Israel.
Jason, let's go to the Abraham Accords, of which you were one of the chief architects, along with your team under the Trump administration. Unprecedented development in Middle Eastern diplomacy back in 2020. Help our viewers understand the position of the Saudi-blessed Gulf-led Abraham Accords and the degree to which your colleagues in the Gulf oppose the Iranian regime's race for regional supremacy under a nuclearizing umbrella, and what the complexities of that relationship that you helped broker is right now under this massive chaos in the Middle East.
So one of the reasons that we were able to achieve the Abraham Accords is the region truly understands the threat that the Iranian regime is, not just to Israel, but to themselves. When we came into office, it was very clear to us that the region had felt abandoned by the administration that preceded us in terms of the Iranian regime. They didn't necessarily say it as publicly, certainly as Prime Minister Netanyahu did, but they were very disappointed in the Iran deal. Of course, they have different ways of handling things. Israel is very outgoing and willing to take steps to try to destroy things because Israel is the first target of the Iranian regime. Countries in the region tend to do it a little bit differently. We even see that from the statements that are coming out of the country, out of those countries from October 7th. I was disappointed in many of those statements, some of which were strengthened in favor of Israel, if you will, in the ensuing days after the atrocities were unveiled. None of them, except perhaps the UAE, put out quite a good statement, but none of them ended up achieving what I would have liked to have seen. But I also recognize that these countries have their own threats from the Iranian regime, and they handle things in their own way. I would pay less attention to those statements and pay much more attention to the reality. And so what's the reality? Last night I did a video on social media where I explained that I'm still a big believer in the Abraham Accords, but I didn't want people just to take my word for it. I included multiple quotes from a senior Emirati official who essentially said, this was at a conference, I believe, in Europe. He essentially said that the Abraham Accords are here to stay. They're essential for the region. They're essential for stability. These are not exact quotes, but they're essential for stability of the region. Jews and Christians have their origins here in the region. They recognize that. So I believe that the Abraham Accords vis-a-vis the UAE, and I believe Bahrain, are here to stay. I think we're going to go through somewhat of a challenging time, but I think they understand the necessity of it. Even Saudi Arabia, and at the moment, whatever peace talks were being discussed between Saudi Arabia and President Biden's administration and Israel are probably derailed at the moment. I don't mean derailed in a bad way, but sidetracked. But I think that Saudi Arabia understands the need for peace with Israel. Certainly Israel understands that. The United States understands it now more than ever since October 7th. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has made certain requests of the United States and Israel. Those requests make a lot of sense for Saudi Arabia. I think they're very smart and important requests on the side of Saudi Arabia. The question is whether Israel could deliver in terms of the Palestinians. And now it's going to be even more challenging because of October 7th and what's been happening in terms of the Palestinians. And it's going to be hard for President Biden to get Congress to be able to meet the Crown Prince's requests. So now's not necessarily the time to discuss it, but we all understand that one day, hopefully sooner rather than later, this war will be successful and over. And the Abraham Accords and Abraham Accords 2.0 and 3.0 are essential for stability and security, not just for Israel, but for every country in the region, even if some don't understand that yet.
Jason, how do you understand, or how can we understand the inherent tensions in the Gulf between the public that is exposed to the number one hornet's nest of visual terrorism, which is Al Jazeera, and the leadership of the Gulf And on the one hand, His Excellency Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia, or MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed of the Emirates, and the Bahraini leadership have stated positive intentions about continuing the relationship with Israel in the Abraham Accord context. However, what is the tension point in which they can't manage or control or influence their publics that it could be argued are very sympathetic to this Palestinian moment? What is the point at which they can no longer say that they can lead their publics on this ongoing journey called the Abraham Accord journey, and at which they have to sort of step back or step aside?
So each country is different. I'll just start with Jordan for a second. Jordan, I'm sure, wasn't really part of your question, but of course, Jordan has anywhere from a 50 to 70% population of Palestinians, and it's almost impossible for Jordan to do anything, even if King Abdullah was willing to, and I don't think he is, but even if he was willing to. And we saw at a spark when Israel was wrongfully accused of attacking the hospital, just how quickly the street mobilized, and fiercely in terms of the passion that it inflamed. The countries in the Gulf are different. Some are very small, some are much larger, like Saudi Arabia. And of course, we're dealing with decades of misinformation that was fed to them, not just from Al Jazeera, as you say, but even in their education system, which is changing and has changed in so many positive ways. So each of them does have to be concerned about, what is that tipping point where they can both pursue the Abraham Accords or speak openly and honestly about what's going on, and at the same time, not have to worry about a bunch of people gathering in the street who think differently than we do, partly because they were taught differently, partly because the news coverage is just terrific. And I think they work hard at that all the time. I know that I witnessed it when I was at the White House, and I don't envy their position right now. They really have to try to both be on the right side of history and speak openly and honestly, but at the same time recognize that, let's call it, the street exists, and they have to be very careful with that. I think the only way we can do it, and I'm sort of at the vortex of this because on social media, I'm both followed by people who support Israel, but also many in the Arab world, And while I have many positive comments about what I'm saying, I have many extraordinarily hateful comments. And I'm constantly getting into battles with people who claim that Israel's committing war crimes and that all these things that I'm sure you've heard of, that Israel destroyed the hospital. Now, of course, with the hit in on the refugee camp, most of the story is really about the deaths of the Palestinian civilians, and very little of the story is about what you said at the beginning of the talk, which is who you were targeting, what was targeted, how it fell into the tunnels, how Hamas usurped all the money, stole all the money for its weapons, how Hamas cares nothing about the Palestinians. Nobody really believes that, and everybody's quick to point the finger to the war crime accusation.
Would you say that, I remember back in 1979, there were 53 American hostages that were held by the Islamic Republic of Iran until January 20th, 1980, when Ronald Reagan became president of the United States, that were released on that day. If this were an American story with 250 children, toddlers, and elderly among them held held by a terror organization, would this be a different story in your view from where you sit?
Right. So it depends on who's the president, right? President Carter did one thing, Reagan jumps in, and all of a sudden the hostages are released. I do think, and again, I've been very complimentary about the Biden administration for so many reasons. I think what they're doing is important. I think how they're even telegraphing, it's changing a little bit in the last couple of days, but generally speaking, how they've telegraphed Israel's right to defend itself and what it's doing. I would leave out the part about Israel has to limit civilian casualties. Israel knows that. It's not an interest. It's not in Israel's interest not to limit civilian casualties. I would leave out the part about Israel complying with international law. Of course, Israel knows that. Generally speaking, they say good things. What I wonder, and what I hope is at least on the table that's being discussed, is why is America not thinking about special forces going into Gaza to rescue those hostages? Israel, of course, always wants to fight its own battles by itself. It doesn't want American boots on the ground, but this is not Israel's ground, right? This is Gaza. There are American hostages there. And I hope, I'm not saying they should do it. I don't have enough experience to know whether they should do it or not. I don't know all the many, many difficult calculations and choices that have to be made. But I at least hope that on the table of what's happening at the Pentagon and the White House is considering whether the United States Special Forces should join forces with Israel to try to get those hostages released, not just the Americans, of course, but all the nationalities, including, of course, the bulk of them who are Israeli.
Absolutely. And Jason, there's another question when we talk about getting those hostages released, and that is pressuring Qatar and Turkey, who have the strongest relationships with the Hamas leadership, who have funded them, hosted them, and there are Hamas leaders right now, as we speak, in Qatar. I am wondering, as an analyst or a student of the Middle East, why it's 26 days later and there are Hamas leaders walking around Qatar free, and America seems not to have used its enormous leverage on not only political leverage, but military, security leverage, having a major base in Qatar in order to free the hostages. I mean, Qatar has been sending tens of millions of dollars every month to Hamas in Gaza. And really, one wonders what it is that has failed the United States in leveraging their position with the Qataris.
I'll start with Turkey, then I'll get to Qatar. So Turkey, President Erdogan made a horrible statement the other day, and this, by the way, weeks after he and the Prime Minister of Israel sort of tried to make amends and I believe invited each other to each other's countries. I think Turkey is just not going to be helpful here, not interested in being helpful, and clearly has placed its chips on the side of Hamas. I think Qatar is far more complicated. I can only speak from when I was in the White House and up to including now, which I believe the policy was always the same until the October massacre. Our view in the White House, and I assume President Biden's view, was if Qatar is willing to fund Gaza to keep the temperature down, and the Israeli government wanted that and was very much a part of those decisions, our view was not to second guess Israel and allow Qatar to fund Gaza to keep that temperature down. We can go back, and I'm sure there'll be many discussions about this after the war, when all the investigations happen about how this happened and what the policies were that led to this, whether they were right or wrong. We could go back and debate whether that was a good policy or not a good policy, but our view was not to second guess Israel's policy on that. In terms of hosting Hamas, Qatar's position has been, and I believe it was logical at the time, though obviously things have changed dramatically since the October massacre. Qatar's position was having those leaders in Qatar, being able to talk to them from a rational perspective, because Qatar leadership is indeed very rational, as opposed to having them based somewhere where there's no control of them, and then who knows what happens, whether it be in Iran or elsewhere, or even Gaza. They felt that having that leverage was a very useful tool, and I think we've seen, not nearly as much as we would like yet, although I understand there are discussions in the works, it's all public reporting that's saying this. Their view is being Qatar, having Hamas here, has allowed us to get those hostages released and hopefully get more hostages released. And I think there's a lot of validity to that. Of course, it'll remain to be seen, can they actually use that leverage and get more hostages out? And over the coming days, we hope for such good news. But going forward, these are very legitimate questions. Going forward, now that we've seen what happened, should Qatar host these Hamas operatives? Should they be dropped by helicopter back into Gaza or some other solution? And these are valid questions that are not easy to answer, but definitely something that should be focused on.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think what Dan, Jason was describing was that entire concept that Israel and its military establishment had as to what to do with Gaza. For many years, the Qatar support for Hamas in Gaza started in 2018. After the first attempts, really, the Great March of Return and the first attempts of Hamas to swarm our borders and to carry out the October 7th massacre. That was the intelligence that Israel had at the time that they were planning to do, and Israel managed to put a stop to those efforts. If you remember, the most bloody day, I'm sure Jason will remember it, of those incidents was the 14th of May, the day that the US embassy was opened. And really, Israel at the time had much more important things to worry about, as we saw it. So it was okay to try and feed this monster in Gaza. Unfortunately, that conception really did fail, and it's a conception that hasn't really changed entirely all the way through. And for this, Jason, maybe we'll go on to another conception that the Trump administration was very heavily involved in, and is now playing out also in Israel. One of the great achievements of both of the Trump administration and of the way that the dialogue was held with the Palestinians was that this whole idea of paying salaries to terrorists is unacceptable. It's something that needs to stop. That was the Taylor Force Act, which also passed at the same time. That was the conversations also with Mahmoud Abbas, and now we're seeing again the decision of Bezalel Smotrich, partly answering the call of the JCPA, of our suggestion from a few weeks ago, that Israel's government stop transferring that money to Mahmoud Abbas, both because he hasn't condemned the attacks, because he supports the attacks, because Fatah and the Palestinian Authority have been very vocal in their support of the attacks, and because of the simple fact that as part of that pay-for-slay policy, Mahmoud Abbas is now going to pay the terrorists who were involved in that massacre, the terrorists who have been arrested, those who were killed at the time of the attack. And so that was our demand, our request, our recommendation to the Israeli government. Minister of Finance Bezalel Smotrich answered that call and wrote to Prime Minister Netanyahu saying that he had decided not to transfer the funds. And then suddenly we have a report this morning from the Biden administration that they are urging the Israeli government to continue on passing those funds to Mahmoud Abbas, to continue funding this whole project of pay-for-slay, to continue funding the underlying causes behind not only Iran behind these terrible attacks, but also that entire Nazi demonization of Israel along that whole period. So really my question here to you, Jason, is what would you recommend to the Biden administration at the moment? Should Israel keep on funding the Palestinian Authority with all of its malfeasances, or should we just leave that alone, continue doing what we did yesterday and on the 6th of October and a month and 2 months ago, just stay in that conception that we can actually feed and appease the monster?
Really important that you brought up Taylor Force, the pay to slay, because as people are thinking about the day after Gaza and want to give the Palestinian Authority a role in potentially governing Gaza, if they govern Gaza and keep the pay to slay in place, I mean, that's just horrendous. We're sort of just feeding into that whole cycle. And I commend Senator Graham and people like Sandra Gerber, who were instrumental in getting the Taylor Force law passed. But you asked a very direct and complicated question. If I were in the White House, I don't know that I would agree with Bezalel Smotrich's position here. And I'd want to sit with him and the military and the intelligence on the Israeli side to understand that, you know, while I'm sympathetic to his position, I totally understand it. And it boils my blood just to think about what they do with their money to entice and encourage people, Palestinians, to harm and murder Israelis. I understand the mindset. But the question is, in the midst of what's going on now, not just the war against Hamas, but the tension with Lebanon and the potential of cycling beyond, into a much wider regional conflict. Is this the time to make that point? Or is that going to inflame areas of what I call Judea Samaria, others call the West Bank? Is this going to now open up an even worse front within the West Bank, which is going to be complicated? My gut is I don't think it's the right time to do it, but I just don't have enough information as to what your Israel's military and intelligence think is going to happen if you do that. Because ultimately, the more pressure you put on the situation, the more challenging things are going to be. And I think Israel has enough challenges at the moment and does not need to open up that other front. It's just a gut reaction.
Yeah, Jason, thank you ever so much for joining us. You've given us a really great perspective and context on the regional challenges here in this Middle East, ever changing obstacles and opportunities, both a very dangerous time facing, I think, the global Jewish community, because what happens here echoes immediately into North America, Europe, and around the world. Any parting comments, observations on your side as a former senior diplomat of the United States government?
I just want to circle back to the PR campaign. You know, typically Israel has not done a great job explaining itself to the world. I think this time they've done an excellent job. They're putting out surrogates who can speak to the world in English, in American or British or Australian, depending on, or maybe South African, depending on the speaker, in real English, talking about the issues. I think they need to do more and constantly do that, because otherwise they're going to lose the PR battle all over the world, in particular in America. So if there's anything that I could stress is, as fast as they get accurate information, to get on screen and explain what's going on. Obviously, don't do things shooting from the hip, but it's such an important part of what is going on today. I can't stress that enough.
Okay, well, we'll pass that on for sure and continue to do our daily update right here at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, which we send out also in written form after the update. And please go to our Instagram site called October 7th, which has all sorts of visual cognitive, we call it cognitive warfare and perception influence videos as well. To basically unearth, uncover, expose, reveal the lies of Hamas and the Iranian regime, and do a lot of corrective visuals, reframing the conflict in truth as what it really is today. So anyway, we pray for peace in Jerusalem, and we hope that we'll overcome this terrible ISIS-type organization, and also overcome the Iranian regime's 44-year plan to destroy Israel and the United States, by the way, through its proxies in the region and around the world. So Jason Greenblatt, Special Envoy under the Trump administration for the Arab world and the Middle East. We hope to be seeing you again in a similar position, if that's the way the destiny holds. And anyway, we're very, very pleased to have you as a special scholar at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs in charge of Arab-Israeli diplomacy. And we'll look forward to having you back real soon and seeing you in person, even more important.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for all that you do.
Thank you. Good to see you. Thank you, everyone from across the seas, for joining us. Tomorrow we will be at 3 o'clock in the afternoon because of the 6-hour time difference, 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Thank you, everyone, for joining.